Welcome to Text Readings with Greg Stafford, where we progressively work our way through the ancient biblical records and related texts and histories so that we can become more familiar with these texts and histories. And we want to know specifically what they have to say took place as it pertains to the god Jah and to the ones that he used, the ones we call prophets. Some were other things, right, like kings, King David, King Solomon. And of course, Jesus. He's really the main one as it pertains to the histories and the beliefs associated with the god Jah, which is why in Revelation 19, ultimately, every living thing praises Jah. But there were other important figures as well. One of those figures is Moses. And we've been talking about Moses and the history of Moses and his upbringing in Egypt, him being cast out or leaving Egypt, and now him being sought out by that god Jah I talked about to take him back to Egypt for the purpose of telling the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, to let the Hebrews go, the people who are under hard labor and slavery. We see remnants of that in many places in Egypt today. This god Jah is picking out Moses and sending him back with power, with a staff, and with the knowledge of his name that is going to be shown in a way that the Hebrews have not seen yet. They've seen many things in the history of their people, including their patriarch Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one who was in Egypt during the time when Joseph lived there, before things changed and they no longer lived there, but their children do. And these children grew up during a time in Egypt where the Egyptians really didn't like the Hebrews, and they never ultimately accepted them as Egyptian brothers, even during the time of Joseph, who effectively was the ruler of the Egyptians on behalf of Pharaoh. And so now Moses is going back with this power, with this knowledge of the name that's going to be shown to them in a new way, not shown before, that will involve their coming to know him in a way they didn't before, because while Jacob and Joseph were in Egypt, they were not enslaved in Egypt. And even though Abraham went to Egypt, he was not enslaved in Egypt. And the promise made to Abraham by this god Jah was that his seed would become many and ultimately be given the entire land of Canaan. And specifically when Jah is speaking to Moses, according to the text we reviewed in our prior readings, he tells them that the Hebrews are going to find out now that he is Jehovah, the fullest form of the name we use most often, although his name most likely was pronounced, according to the best available evidence, as Jaho in an anglicized form. Jaho, Jehovah. I talked about it in my last show on the pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton, so I encourage you to review it. But we're still going to use the name that is best to use according to the best available evidence, Old and New Testament, and in the surrounding cultures and histories and context, Jah. The one, as I said earlier in reference to Revelation 19, all those living will one day praise. They sing the song of Moses, Revelation also says, which is recorded in Exodus 15, where again they praise Jah. So, nevertheless, however you pronounce the Tetragrammaton, Jehovah, Jehovah, Jaho, the Hebrews in this context are going to find out about it now in a way that Abraham and their forefathers did not before. They knew the name. We showed that. We showed how Abraham built an altar and called upon the name. But he didn't know that in a way that now his seed is going to see and know. And they're not the only ones to whom Jaho is going to show his power and leave an impression that means they have come to know him in a different way, just like the Hebrews. So we read about in our last reading in Exodus 6 how Jaho was telling Moses this, explaining his name. And then, because I have not translated every text in the Bible or in Exodus, and we do these text readings according to what I have done to date, the time between this reading and our last reading, Exodus 6, 1 through 3, and Exodus 7, 1 through 6, which we'll get to in a moment, Moses kind of continues on and tells Jaho, at first, he goes to the Hebrews, and they don't listen to him, right? Because it says that they're just in too hard of slavery. It's too much burden, right? They're not responsive to Moses because they don't see it happening. Not yet. This is what Jaho is bringing about. So first he sends in Moses. Moses gets distressed, right? Again, he's like, I'm uncircumcised in lips. I can't talk to these people. They won't even listen to me. How is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, going to take me seriously, right? And then in part of Exodus 6, it talks about the different families of the Hebrews in Egypt, including Moses and Aaron's lineage. And now, after Moses once again declares that he thinks he's unfit to go to Pharaoh, we get to this. Exodus chapter 7. We're going to read verses 1 through 6 according to the Hebrew and Greek translations. So let's see what it has to say. Verse 1, Hebrew translation. Then Jaho began to say to Moses, Behold, I have made you God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother will become your prophet. In the Hebrew text, it uses the word Elohim for God here, when it says that Jaho would make Moses God to Pharaoh. Verse 1, Greek translation, Then Lord Jaho spoke to Moses, saying, Behold, I have appointed you God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother will be your prophet. In the Greek text, it uses a form of the word theos, without the article. Verse 2, Hebrew translation. You will speak everything. This is Jaho still speaking to Moses. You will speak everything which I direct you to speak, and Aaron your brother will speak to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh will send the sons of Israel away from his land. Verse 2, Greek translation. And you will tell him everything, as much as I command you. But Aaron your brother will speak to Pharaoh in order to send the sons of Israel away from Pharaoh's hand. Pharaoh's land. Verse 3, Hebrew translation. And I will harden the heart or mind of Pharaoh, after I have displayed many of my signs and my powers in the land of Egypt. Verse 3, Greek translation. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will increase my signs and wonders in Egyptian land. Verse 4, Hebrew translation. Pharaoh will not listen to you. Therefore, I have put my hand among the Egyptians, and I have determined to bring forth my vast group, my people Israel, from the land of the Egyptian by a great judgment, or by great judgments. Verse 4, Greek translation, Pharaoh will not listen to you. So I will lay my hand upon Egypt, and with power I will bring out my people, the sons of Israel. With a great act of justice I will lead them away from the land of Egypt. Verse 5, Hebrew translation, then I will have caused the Egyptians to know that I am Jaho. After I extend my hand out over the Egyptians, and after I have brought forth the sons of Israel from their midst. Verse 5, Greek translation. Then all of the Egyptians will know that I am Lord Jaho, who is stretching out the land. I'm sorry, I keep seeing hand and land differently. Who is stretching out the hand upon Egypt, and I will lead the sons of Israel out from their midst. It's because I have land and hand in alternating text, right? It's land here, hand here, and I apologize. I'll focus more clearly on that. Verse 6, Hebrew translation, then just as Jaho, had directed them, in the same way, that is what Moses and Aaron did. And you notice I'm speaking a little bit differently when I say the divine name, just because, right, as we talked about in the pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton video, we need to start getting used to hearing that. It takes time. We have reasons to end the divine name in a final aspirant to help us get used to it. We have a utility form of the divine name, meaning one that it can be used to show people the most likely pronunciation form, Jaho, plus a final aspirant based on the evidence we talked about, We use Ja, very regularly, and probably, that should be our default if it isn't already. But Jaho is not to be ignored. So, because I constructed this form of the divine name in a way to allow us to say both Jaho and Jahoah, then at times I might emphasize the one and then follow the final aspirant, because I think that will still show both. Then Moses and Aaron did just as Lord Jaho commanded them. They acted just like that. They did what he said. All right, let's talk about some of this. So, I pointed out the terms used in the text as far as the Hebrew. It also does not use the article in the Hebrew. I should point that out. So it uses Elohim in verse 1 for God, that Jahoah would make Moses God to Pharaoh. So it says Elohim in the Hebrew text, and then it uses a form of theos, as I said, theon, the accusative form, without the article. So what does this mean? How is it that Moses can be presented here as someone appointed by God to be God on his behalf? How exactly is that possible? Well, look at what he says in verse 2, right? Right? This isn't what Aaron is going to do. Aaron is the prophet, right? He's ultimately going to speak. But Aaron is going to speak what Moses tells him in his weaker voice, and then Aaron will say it in the better voice. Verse 2, you will speak. And this is right after he says, Moses is worried about his mouth and all that, right? In the end of chapter 6. And he says, I'm going to make you God, Elohim, Theos, to Pharaoh. And then he references Aaron, but then he goes back to Moses, right? I'm going to make you God to Pharaoh. You will speak everything. I will direct you to speak. Greek. You will tell him and Aaron everything as much as I, Jaho, command you. Is that not what this text explicitly teaches as to how Moses is made God to Pharaoh? Right? He's not made a god in the sense of being, divinized in a way that he becomes a manifestation of a spirit being as a godlike one, right? Like in Judges, where Manoah and his wife, behold, the angel ascending in the flame of fire off the altar. And they say, it's a God we have seen. He's not talking about making Moses that, right? No, because we already know he doesn't become that. And he explicitly teaches in verse 2 how it is Moses is going to be God to Pharaoh. So he's really what? He's in his limited human role himself, right? He's Jaho to Pharaoh. He is speaking only what Jah tells him to say. And it even says that makes him God in that way to Pharaoh. Now, we all know. I'm not even going to reference the texts. They're so numerous and plenty, right? And I've done it so many times, right? John 7, John 8, John 14, just to name a few chapters in one book. And this is stuff that's all over the place. But in John, throughout, continuously, recording what Jesus says, I have come down not to do my own will, but the will of him that sent me. I don't even teach what is mine. I teach what I heard and what I learned from the Father. I'm not speaking of my own initiative. I'm saying exactly what the Father told me to say. You, Moses, will speak everything I direct you to say. Jesus, to the Jews, I am speaking only what the Father has told me to say. I learned from him. These aren't my words. He told me what to say. I'm not speaking of my own origination. The Father, John 14:10, is doing his works through me. So why are you asking me, show us the Father? What you're seeing is the Father. He's the one doing all this. This is his stuff. Moses to Pharaoh. Whose stuff, right? Whose teachings? All of it. That's what I mean by stuff. Everything. All that I command you, you speak. I only speak what the Father tells me. Same thing. There's no denying that. So, there's also no denying then, is there, that this serves as a precedent for Jesus being God to us in exactly the same way. And he is exactly that according to the things John says he says or said, right? The same things that are said here to Moses. You're only going to say what I tell you to say. I only say what the Father tells me to say. It's the same thing. And they're both acting. It doesn't say acting, right? It doesn't use like a qualifying term like as or like. It says literally a point or set. Put you in the place, the position of God, Elohim, Theos, to Pharaoh. Why? How? Because you're only going to be doing what I tell you to do, and you're going to be doing it with power. The Son of Man came while he wasn't in his full power. He was able to do miracles, some of the same things Moses could do, many things greater, right? So how could he not be considered God to us? If he says over and over again that every single thing he teaches and says is what the Father tells him to teach and say. And if that is exactly the way in which the Bible describes a prominent figure like Moses being God to Pharaoh, I don't see how there could be an issue at all, right? I mean, how would it not be more appropriate, in fact, for Jesus to be God to us than Moses? And isn't exactly that the case, right? We're reading our Bible in the Trinity and Conflict series. What? Jesus has been enthroned. He's become better than the angels, Hebrews 1. He's been put on God's throne, Revelation 2, 3, given the authority to sit on his Father's throne and to allow others to sit on his Father's throne. And effectively, if you're on the Father's throne ruling, what are you? Somebody put in the chat, if you really believe you're on the Father's throne with all authority in heaven and on earth, and Jesus then gives that authority to those who are with him, ruling with that authority, right? But he's giving it to them, right? They're his bride. But they have it, right? But they're where? They're being allowed to sit on the Father's throne. He's enthroning them. How is that not being God to us? Are they not doing exactly what the Father tells them to do? Right? They're not God separate from him. Not Jesus, and not those ruling with him. We're really acknowledging whom when we submit to them. Jah. I'm not talking about humans on earth. I'm talking about the ones we know are enthroned with Jesus in the heavens. And they're in that position ruling for Jah. How is that not being God to us? What else could it be? Are they God? No. They're being appointed to be that to us because that's all they are. Just like Moses was to Pharaoh, in a more limited sense, right? But if he can be that to Pharaoh because he says only what Jah tells him to say, it's what the text says. Explicit teaching. Connected directly to that appointment and setting Moses as God, really, right? Because he's only speaking for Jehovah, not as a separate God. That's the same thing with Jesus and those who die faithful to him and are raised to rule with him. Is it not? It is. It's what the texts explicitly teach. That God, his God, anoints him with oil more than his partners, right? Jesus says he makes those who rule with him a pillar in the temple of his God. They have the name of his God written on them and their new name. So Jesus is elevated, like we read in Hebrews 1, Philippians 2, given the name above every name, the position that leads to the exaltation of the Father's glory. Well, that's being God to us in a way that doesn't compromise the one thing being God must not compromise, right? The Father's glory. That's number one, right? Moses cannot start talking on his own and go outside of what God tells him to do here, can he? Not and still be God. Could Jesus have gone outside of what the Father told him to say and still have been God to us? How so? That's not according to how the texts show us is the case, or what Jesus himself says. And why would he say that if that's the case? He'd be saying just his own things, right? There'd be no point in submitting entirely to the Father as the source of authority for what to even say or teach. Right? So he can't say or teach anything else and still be that God to us. All right. Now, you may say, well, okay, Greg, that's a good parallel in the human sense, right? So Moses serves as God to Pharaoh. So Jesus, he was God to us while he was on earth. John 14:10, right? You've seen me, you've seen the Father. But then he's resurrected, and now, that's being God to us in the full divine sense. Although, I'm going to set aside the two natures part right now. I've dealt with that in my Bible and the Trinity in Conflict. I invite you to watch the series if you haven't already. We'll get back to it tomorrow, by the way, part 9. But back to this text reading. So, they may say, well, he's in his exalted state. This is not the same thing as Moses being God, right? It's a human. So obviously Jesus in a divine sense is God in a different way. John 1:1. That's the point, kind of, right? Because let's look at that a little closer. If it's okay for a human, Moses or the last Adam, human, fully human. We're going to get to this in great detail when we get back to Philippians 2, but we've talked about it quite a bit already, especially my part 3 of the Bible and the Trinity in Conflict, where we talked about the second part of Philippians 2. Either way, back to this specific issue, the question of whether it's different for Jesus to be God to us in a spirit sense, as a divine spirit, versus as a man, whether like Moses or while he was a man, I see it as just the opposite. I see it as, if they can be God to us as men, how could it not be possible, more so even then, that a spirit who says only what God says is being God to us? That's even more so going to be the case, and it was numerous times, as we're reading right here in our text readings involving Exodus and the burning bush incident, all the way through the book of Exodus, right? The angel who's appointed and given Jah's name, sent ahead of them, speaks as Jah. It's already happened many times, of course, happens numerous times hereafter. And it happens once more. Let's go ahead and take a look at another text where an angel in a spirit sense is in one of the most explicit and profound ways being God to us. Let's go to Revelation chapter 1. And I am either going to add this as part 5 of my Alpha and the Omega series, or I'm going to do a separate show about it, but this may suffice. So with regard to the Alpha and Omega issue, that is whether or not Jesus ever speaks as the Alpha and the Omega, whether he ever calls himself the Alpha and the Omega, or is referred to as such in the book of Revelation, or is it just the Father, or is it an angel speaking for both, or just the Father in that respect? Let's take a look at Revelation 1. So as you know, in the first 4 videos of the Alpha and the Omega series, I've talked about pretty much most, if not all, of the texts that relate to this issue. But I want to focus in on a couple more here because they relate directly to Exodus 7:1 and the teaching there that others can be God for God without being God, based on how they represent him, and that being true both in a human and a spirit sense based on the accounts of the angels in the Old Testament, and then this account involving Moses. No one really disputes that Jesus in that sense was God to us, right? Emmanuel, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, in that kind of representative sense. I understand Trinitarians see that in a different way as well, but at a fundamental level, we can all say, in that respect, Jesus was God to us. He says it numerous times, I say only what the Father tells me. Just like Moses, Exodus 7. So now we're into this question about how that might relate to the spirit realm, and how spirits can be God, for God, to others. And we've talked about it. But let's focus in on this question one more time in relation to Alpha and Omega. As we know in Revelation 1, let me go ahead and bring you guys up. See if we have the text right. There we go. So this is the NWT. It reads consistently in this case with most other translations, except for the KJV, where in verse 10 it adds an additional description. Alpha, I am the Alpha and the Omega, first and last, beginning and the end, or at least Alpha and the Omega in some variation of that formula. And since in this case the one speaking, in verse 10 it says, by inspiration I came to be in the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a strong voice like that of a trumpet, saying, what you see write in a scroll, send to the 7 congregations, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. It adds, I am the Alpha and the Omega, and even a fuller expression in terms of what it says. In fact, I'll go ahead and bring up the KJV real briefly, because I believe it even says, Lord God Almighty. So in the KJV we read, saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, I am Alpha and Omega, first and last, what thou seest right. So it doesn't say Lord God Almighty there, but it does explicitly use Alpha and Omega in the KJV, based on texts that don't date earlier than the 11th century. Whereas the texts of Revelation 1:11 that we have are as early as the 4th century, and they don't contain that reading, I am the Alpha and the Omega, including Codex Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and other texts, as well as all language versions, including the Syriac, Ethiopic, and Latin Vulgate. All right, so that's one way you can explain to a person who just uses the KJV that the manuscripts don't support the reading that they show in verse 11, which adds that description, I am the Alpha and the Omega. But let's just go with it. Let's just say it explicitly teaches in Revelation 1:11, or anywhere for that matter, right? Revelation 1:11 KJV, and again in manuscripts not earlier than the 11th century. So even if we accept that reading that Jesus expressly identifies himself by being the one who's speaking as the Alpha and the Omega, other than in that text, the KJV manuscripts, related manuscripts, there really isn't an explicit identification with Jesus as the Alpha and the Omega, not even in verse 8, right? Because in verse 8, he says the one who is and was and is coming, which is expressly, who was expressly differentiated from Jesus in verses 4 and 5. May you have grace and undeserved kindness and peace from the one who is and who was and was coming, and from the seven spirits before his throne, and from Jesus Christ. Right? So we know at least here that the Alpha and the Omega, verse 8, is the one who is and who was and was coming, differentiated from Jesus in verse 4. Okay, but then we get to verse 11, right? KJV, 11th century manuscripts, and a few later, others that are later, add the explicit identification of Jesus as the Alpha and the Omega. So let's accept that. How could that be okay? Let's take a look at Revelation 22. Now remember, I've been talking about how Moses has been presented as God to Pharaoh based on the fact that he's saying only what God tells him, and how if a human like Moses, or even Jesus, can be God to us in those ways by saying only what God tells them to say, then the question of whether that could be true in the spirit realm, where spirits don't have the limitations of Moses or the last Adam as a man, there's no inconsistency or reason why that wouldn't be the case, particularly since we've shown that's the case by reviewing all those accounts where angels as public servants, flames of fire, did just that, right? They were God to all of those people they spoke to, and no one else. Right? Even when they were asked their name, some of them, they just said, why do you ask my name, right? So clearly it's not God there. They're speaking for him, as him, just like Moses was. And just like this angel does here. Look at this. We talked about it in the earlier parts of the Alpha and Omega video series. Look at this again with me. All right. So as you can see, in verse 1, the reference is made to he. He showed me a river of water of life. Clear as crystal, right? So we're operating under the premise right now that Revelation 1:11 KJV is the legitimate text, identifies Jesus as the Alpha and the Omega. We know that's not the case according to the text evidence of Revelation 1:11, and it's not explicitly made clear in the book of Revelation, but we already know Jesus acts and is God to us in any way he needs to be, right? And so while we're familiar with that with people like Moses and all these angels, for some reason, and I think it has a lot to do with the Trinitarian, controversy, we become more hesitant when it comes to the New Testament and the way that not only Jesus but other angels speak and are God to us. So right here in Revelation 22:1, he showed me a river of water of life, clear as crystal, flowing out from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Verse 2 goes on to describe the things that are around the throne or coming from the throne. Verse 3 further speaks of what will come to be, no more curse. Throne of God and Lamb will be in the city. Slaves will render him sacred service. And by the way, those who look at the account in Daniel 7 as Jesus receiving sacred service, latruo, but then seeing that as a contradiction in our view, because in Matthew 4 or in the Luke account, it says that latruo is only to be given to the God of the Bible, Jaho. They don't realize that the scene in Daniel 7 takes place after the accounts in the New Testament where Jesus said those things to the devil. So of course there was no one else to be given sacred service or latrue at the time that he refuted the devil. That's why Jaho later gave him that opportunity to be given that service to the Father's glory. But don't forget that, because there are a lot of Trinitarian nuts. I had one who posted that question on that video I did about that reading in Daniel, and then deleted my pinning of his question to that video because I explained what I just explained now, and I guess he didn't like that very much. So I don't want you to forget about it. All right, so that's in reference to the sacred service here. We've already addressed that. They will see his face. His name will be on their foreheads. Remember I talked about that? Also, night will be no more. They have no need of lamplight, nor do they have sunlight. Jaho. It says God, right? New NWT uses Jehovah in places where it's not quoted, but so let's just move past it. We've already talked about that. The rule is kings forever. And he. All right, this is the first time since verse 1 that we have a connection with the same being showing John these things. He showed him a river of water of life, right? And he said to me, these words are faithful and true. Yes, Jehovah, the God of the inspired expressions of the prophets, sent his angel to show his slaves the things that must shortly take place. And we know that Jehovah has angels, Jah has angels, Jesus has angels, Michael has angels, right? Revelation 12. So I'm not going to get off on that, but I want to mention it in case people are just kind of curious about it. So it says here that God sent his angel to show his slaves the things that would take place. Right? And it's the angel talking to him, telling him, John, that God sent him, his angel, to do this. Then that same angel continues, and look, I am coming quickly. Happy is anyone observing the words of the prophecy of this scroll. I am coming quickly. Who's talking there? Well, look at verse 8. Well, I, John, was the one hearing and seeing these things, and when I had heard what we just read was said to him and seen, I fell down to worship before the feet of the angel that had been showing me these things. The angel was just starting to speak for Jaho and Jesus, depending on the context. But he just had started, right? He just told him, these words are faithful and true. Jah is the God of the inspired expressions, according to the NWT, but it's God. He sent his angel. Angel goes on to say, I am coming quickly. Happy is anyone observing the words of the prophecy of this scroll. And then John interrupts him and begins to worship him because of the way he's talking. But the angel in verse 9 tells him, be careful, don't do that. All I am is a fellow slave of you and of your brothers who are prophets, and of those who are observing the words of this scroll worship God. Right? The angel's a public servant, just like the angels in the Old Testament, right? But they still appear as God. All of them did, and do, and are right here. And that's why John falls down right after he says, I'm coming quickly, right? He's either speaking for Jah or Jesus, and they're above him in ways that John would recognize as having, the position of God to him being on the Father's throne. What he wrote about in Revelation 2 and 3. Now he's almost home. And so here, look, verse 10, he. Who's he? The angel, right? The one who's talking to him. He's hearing, he's seeing, falls down before the angel showing him and telling him these things. Angel corrects him, right? He's not the king. He's not the one like Hebrews 1:6 speaks about and Philippians 2, elevated to the position of king so that he is God to us and we all worship Jesus to the glory of whom? The Father. And so the angel goes on, verse 10, he tells me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this scroll, for the appointed time is near. He that is doing unrighteousness, this is the angel. Let him do unrighteousness still. He makes that comment a few times. Verse 12, look. He resumes exactly what he's saying, was about to tell John right here. See, John interrupted him. And then he goes on to continue to talk to him. And then he resumes pretty quickly after correcting John, saying what he was saying right here. And right after he says that, this is why John was already falling down, right? He's already talking like whom? God. And so he goes on, verse 13. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Happy are those who wash their robes, that the authority to go to the trees of life may be theirs, and that they may gain entrance into the city by its gates outside of the dogs. See, angel going on and on. Then, only in verse 16 do we get the same kind of break we get not only elsewhere in Revelation, but right here, right? The angel's talking, and then John, right after, says, I, John. But that does not identify John as the angel, and we see the same thing early in Revelation as I talked about in my other Alpha and the Omega videos. So this actually indicates a break. It doesn't indicate an identification, especially not in every case, right? I mean, we just saw it right here in verse 8. And right here, because we know the angel's talking right here. The angel corrected John. There was no break at all in the he that's talking. The only time we get a break is right here. And what does Jesus say? I, Jesus, sent my angel to bear witness to you people of these things. He's telling John right here. Just like you had Michael and Gabriel telling Daniel. Jesus is telling John, I sent my angel to tell you these things. And what did we read about from the opening verse? Verse 1. Jesus was given a revelation, which is divine information by God, which he then gave to his angels to share with his servants like John. And that's what he says right here at the end, just like it says at the beginning. He sent his angel to tell John all these things. So, my point is, the angels, from Genesis to Revelation, literally, have been God to us. Not because they're God, but because, like with Moses, they're appointed. They're sent by God to tell us what God says. And it's so convincing, John fell down and started to worship. But the angel corrected him and then continued speaking. Right? Jesus was right there. Who is worshipped by all things to the glory of the Father? The Son. The one who's appointed, right? Made better than the angels because he inherited a better name. Right hand of God. Name above every name. All knees bow, including the angels in heaven and on earth. For him? Because he's God? Or because he's God to us? In an even more complete and better way that we should expect is the case than Moses. Right? Wouldn't it be better and more complete than how a man, whether Moses or even Jesus as a man, was God to us? Of course it would be. Because as a life-giving spirit, he's no longer like us, not even as the last Adam. He's been raised to the right hand of the Father, given all authority to do what? The Father's will. Just like Moses. So there is no problem whatsoever in any sense, representatively, him having all authority to be God to us as a spirit or as a man. There's no contradiction in the biblical text to Moses, Jesus as a man, or Jesus as a spirit, or angels as spirits including Revelation 22 that we just read, being God to us, not because they're God, but because they are doing only what God says. And that's the teaching of the text. So I wanted to spend a little more time on that because Exodus 7 gets brought up a lot in this context. And I believe it should be. While that's not the category of God or gods that Jesus directly belongs in terms of being a spirit with all this authority to speak and be God, for God, it's nonetheless significant because it shows that even humans can be this. And while Jesus in John 10 refers to Psalm 82 as the proper reference for sons of God, either whom are gods whom God condemns or gods whom he approves, because they're only him, not some other God. That's the text Jesus used. And so while I do believe Exodus 7 is applicable, while I do believe other texts are applicable to show the ways in which humans and angels can and were God to us, the text that Jesus used is number one, right? It makes it explicitly clear, an answer to the accusation that, like here in Exodus chapter 7, that while he can be God to Pharaoh, while Moses was God to Pharaoh, that did not make him God. And even though the term for Elohim is used, and in the Greek theos for God, when Jesus was accused of being theos in John 10, he referred to Psalm 82 and the plural usage of theos in his defense. And so we do too. But I do and will refer to this account because it shows as well how people like Moses and people like Jesus can be and are God to us without being God or without compromising the one God's Godship. It's all to the glory of the Father in the way that they're God to us. So how could there be a problem? There isn't. And there never was until the Trinitarians caused one, right? There might have been some other problems, but they really blew it up, right? And so I've decided that after our Bible and the Trinity in Conflict series completes the section on John 1, right? We're going to do part 9 on Hebrews 2 tomorrow night. And we'll finish up with the rest of Hebrews 2 and part of Hebrews 3. And then we'll move back to Philippians 2, finish that up. And then we're going to do the whole prologue of John. But I've already done so many other shows about other texts related to whether Jesus is God or the Trinity, like the Alpha and the Omega, the text we just partially reviewed, and the other videos I've done in that series. I've done videos on the I am sayings of Jesus and the sons of God as gods. So what I've decided to do after we finish with John 1 in the Bible and the Trinity and Conflict series, we're going to do what I planned on doing at some point, and that is move into a discussion of the creeds and the councils and what they teach, and whether or not it's consistent or in conflict with the Bible. So I invite you to join me for that discussion. We'll be back for another text reading possibly this weekend, definitely next week. We'll get back to it. Bible and the Trinity and Conflict part 9. Tomorrow night I'll put up a notice, so look for it. And until then, I hope you have a wonderful afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. I hope I can see you tomorrow for our live stream on part 9. We'll be back to our text readings, as I said, next week. And who knows, we'll do a show maybe on something else this weekend. So I encourage you to check with the channel and see what's happening. I'll do my best to provide you with useful information, shows I think will help you learn more about and draw closer to Jah.